The wind sang low through the bare trees, long before front porches had rocking chairs and pumpkin-scented candles were a thing. The year was 1620-something-ish, give or take a vague winter, and the early European settlers in North America had just realized something dreadful. Winter wasn't just a romantic concept involving snowflakes and hot stew. It was more of a slow, freezing ambush by nature herself. And nature had excellent aim. Let me paint you a picture. A small group of settlers stood amid a clearing, their faces already gaunt from a diet forged mostly of desperation and root vegetables, were pressed with worry. Their wooden shelters, hastily built in the spirit of optimism and poor planning, were about as prepared for a New England winter as a straw hat in a blizzard. And so, necessity being the mother of invention, and also occasionally a stern aunt with frostbite on her nose, these settlers began to devise something special. They needed winter shelters, real ones, not huts with polite gaps, not lean-tos that had the structural integrity of a pre-soggy biscuit. I'm talking about something that might actually save their lives. Enter the concept of the dugout shelter. Not the baseball kind. No chrome bleachers, no nachos. Just earth, loyal insulating soil. These shelters were, quite literally, holes in the ground. But not just any holes. Oh no. These were cozy, cunning cradles of survival, built halfway below the surface of the earth, often carved into hillsides or low embankments, and then covered with timber, bark, sod, or any material that wouldn't immediately catch on fire or fall on you while you tried to sleep. A typical settler dugout was about the size of a small stable, maybe 10 by 12 feet if you were lucky or masochistic, and held anything from a couple to a full, disgruntled family. Inside, the walls were lined with whatever could be spared: animal hides, rough-hewn boards, mossy dreams. A central fire pit provided warmth in theory, terror in practice, and a level of smoke inhalation that frankly deserves its own tragic poem. Life inside these shelters was no picnic, but compared to the outside, which gave off strong nature trying to kill you vibes, they were nothing short of miraculous. The Earth's natural insulation kept temperatures relatively stable. Imagine, while the world above froze and howled, the subterranean world stayed just cozy enough for breath not to become icicles mid-sentence. Of course, privacy was not included. If you've ever tried sleeping 2 feet from Uncle Tobias as he snores in brisk, wolf-like intervals, you'd know the real horror of frontier life was auditory. And yet, as they laid down on whatever counted as bedding, straw, hides, or let's be honest, other people, they were warm enough to stay alive, and alive enough to argue about who was supposed to feed the goats. It was always someone who wasn't in the dugout at the time. Sometimes, these shelters were shared between families who had accidentally bonded over mutual frostbite. Sometimes, one would house a washed-up preacher, a lone widow, or someone with an unusual number of cats. More than once, they fell in. More than once, someone fell in love. These little shelters, humble as they were, became the setting for whispered lullabies, toothless arguments, and the kind of soups made entirely of things that sounded like they shouldn't work, but did. We often think of history as grand moments, declarations, battles, architectural feats. But history also lives in the quiet places, in the shivering corners of dugout shelters where warmth flickered from a fire built one splinter at a time. Places where people weren't yet American or farmers or anything more than stunned survivors holding one another through something no one had words for. Just cold. If you lean in close, you can almost hear them, not talking, too much smoke for that. But living, just enough to write the next page. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, rest easy. The fire's still gently crackling, and we've only just begun to explore what warmth truly meant, long before electric blankets were even dreamt of. When the first frost came drifting down like sleepy goose feathers from the sky, the early settlers scattered around the edges of the New World began to realize that winter wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a formidable, howling entity with opinions. Cold opinions. Opinions like, you should have built a second wall, or that single wool blanket isn't going to cut it, Martha. Picture it. The year is 1621, and you're ankle deep in something ambiguously described as both mud and destiny. Your hat is entirely made of felt. Your boots are more hole than boot, and someone just declared the communal cabbage stash compromised. You know, due to freezing, and possibly raccoons or neighbors. No one could be trusted when the frost made your toes contemplate mutiny. Now, here's the thing most history books fail to mention while they're busy reciting dates like the world's dullest Gregorian karaoke night. Staying alive through winter wasn't just about courage and prayers. No, it was about carpentry, moss, and a suspicious number of haphazard dugouts. While some colonists insisted on building houses that resembled sad little barns with wind funneling through the gaps like it paid rent, others, particularly the clever, sleep-loving ones, looked for something warmer, something lower. Enter the underappreciated hero of early American survival, the earth shelter, a type of semi-subterranean hut designed not for grandeur, but for not dying. Let's drift into the snowy corners of the Virginia colony for a moment, where in the early 1600s, settlers dug their homes into hillsides or built thick-walled sunken huts. These were not stately homes. They were, at best, cozy burrows, with a roof made of bark, mud, straw, and probably the occasional disoriented squirrel. But they did what mattered most. They trapped heat, blocked the wind, and allowed their occupants to stew slightly less in existential dread every night. Historians call them dugouts or pit houses. The folks who lived in them often called them blessedly warm, or possibly better than that drafty barn Giles built, depending on who you asked. Their entrances were typically low and covered with animal hides or wooden slabs to keep the warmth in and the cold out. And bonus, they doubled as very effective complaint mufflers. Contrary to popular myth, which has a habit of imagining every colonial settler as a cross between a chandelier and a lesson, the people building these winter shelters weren't clueless. They borrowed from indigenous knowledge, from the wisdom of tribes that had survived countless winters with techniques refined over generations. It turns out that if you stop shouting civilization long enough to watch how others live, you learn how to not freeze quite as quickly. In fact, the Iroquois longhouses and the winter lodges of the Mandan people were architectural lullabies, long, insulated, and designed with an understanding of how smoke rises and how snow insulates when it doesn't try to crush your roof like a judgmental pastry. The settlers who paid attention survived. The ones who didn't, well, let's just say a few names dropped off the church ledger. But the true charm of these early winter shelters lives not in blueprints or survivor counts, but in the small details. The worn pathways that led to root cellars filled with turnips and hope. The hearths made from stone and stubbornness, where families curled like commas around flickering firelight. The collective understanding that compromising on aesthetics in favor of insulation might be the only stylish decision that winter allowed. And nestled within those walls, be they bark, adobe, or mercifully borrowed native techniques, were stories. Stories told in flickering firelight, of back home, of the time someone mistook a bear for their Uncle Thomas, or vice versa, of meals made entirely from potatoes and whatever was pretending to be a spice. Sleep, after all, settled easier in warmth. And if the roof leaked slightly or the smoke got cheeky, well, that was merely ambience. As one settler probably didn't say, but definitely should have, it's not smoke inhalation, it's seasoning for the soul. And while the wind above howled like unpaid opera students, those tucked into their earthen shelters often felt a strange and lovely peace. Because even in a brutal winter, cleverness and borrowed wisdom made a snug little difference. Now, with the fire banked low and the frost climbing the pane's memory of glass, let us follow the scent of that warmth, through drift and darkness, to where new shelters rise under trembling stars. By the time December creaked its snowy boots across the floorboards of the new world, the settlers had made a grand discovery. You cannot eat optimism, and fireplaces don't build themselves. Few came prepared for the sort of winter that could snap your wagon axle with a glance. Europe had its share of brisk Decembers, sure, but European winter might tip its hat at you before slipping away. This new land, this was a growling, frostbitten beast of a season, and it had more blizzards than manners. Those arriving from across the sea had imagined, perhaps, a rustic sort of discomfort. A little chilly, a bit draughty, but manageable with good spirits and thicker socks. Instead, they found themselves on the threshold of something far more intimate. A relationship with winter that could only be described as life-threateningly personal. At first, they tried sleeping in their ships, hunched over barrels of salt pork and dwindling hope. But when icy winds came rattling the sails like angry phantoms, many realized the ocean was not fit for hibernation. So they turned toward shore and to the trees. The earliest shelters were, in the most generous sense, huts, hurriedly built from downed logs, thick mud, or whatever passed for it, and dreams that survived long enough to freeze. Some had thatched roofs made of reeds and grasses. Others featured more exciting architectural decisions like hole in the wall where the wind lives now. These makeshift winter dens were the very definition of compromise. Not a cozy frontier cabin exactly, not yet, but better than nothing-shaped hypothermia. One of the more curious early structures was the dugout, a sort of halfway hug from nature. Settlers would quite literally dig a hole into the side of a hill or embankment and roof it over with logs, branches, dirt, and whatever dignity they had left. This was quite possibly the first American real estate that came with earthy vibes in the listing. The benefits were surprisingly practical. Dugouts were naturally insulated, with the earth holding in warmth and blocking out the keener teeth of the wind. And while they weren't spacious, the average family of 5 could barely sneeze in unison. They were protectively snug, like being held by the planet itself. Of course, there were downsides. Water seeped in. Walls occasionally collapsed, reminding occupants that their landlord was gravity. And let's not even speak of the clicking coal beetles that shared the floor plan. But for many settlers, a damp den in the side of a hill beat open sky and prayer. In New England, where snow posed a quarterly existential threat, settlers began experimenting with chimneyless cabins, small log structures with a central fire pit, and, well, no funnel for the smoke. This went about as, well, as you'd imagine. Families would sit cross-legged in a haze of soot, tears, and second-hand regret, cheering quietly whenever the draft happened to carry the smoke out rather than in. Eventually, someone had the radical epiphany of, what if hole up? Thus inventing the chimney. Let's all take a moment to thank that wheezing genius. Log cabins began to evolve, becoming sturdier and smokier, but genuinely life-sustaining. Moss or clay was mashed between logs to block the wind, what we call chinking. Admittedly, it sounds like something you'd whisper to your horse, but it was an essential part of surviving winter's bite. Still, innovation sprang from desperation. In Pennsylvania, for example, settlers used bank barns, multi-level structures built into hillsides, where livestock huddled on the lower level and human beings lived just above. The combined body heat meant that both cow and kin managed to make it through January without becoming lawn ornaments. Some even lined their walls with animal skins or wool, not just for decor, but to create the hearty colonial equivalent of insulation. This was before proper walls were insulated, of course, when cozy meant only 3 layers of frost on your beard. What these early shelters lacked in architecture awards, they made up for in soul. They were scratched together by frozen fingers and sheer stubborn will, nestled at the edge of forests, puffing a single thread of smoke into the chilly air, cradling life where all else slept. And while they may not have been the grand homesteads immortalized in paintings, they were the quiet proof that humanity could improvise a warm corner in the middle of nowhere. As snow settled deeper outside and the first wolf song floated across the trees, the settlers wrapped themselves in bearskin and bravery, huddled in their earthen dens, knowing that survival sometimes looks precisely like living in a hole, with family. Before long, new ideas would emerge, some inspired, some delightfully reckless, about how to endure the wrath of a winter empire. One such idea involved a surprising degree of stolen beaver fur, a communal bread oven, and the advice of someone who claimed to be sort of friends with the snow. Now, if you've ever tried to build a house with frostbitten fingers and a diet that consists largely of dried peas and optimism, you'll appreciate just how impressive it was when early settlers managed to construct something vaguely resembling shelter in the chill of a North American winter. And I say shelter with the generous spirit of someone describing a soggy burlap sack as haute couture. It was the 17th century, the time of powdered wigs, wooden teeth, and a truly questionable relationship with hygiene. Across the wilderness of the New World, huddled clusters of settlers faced the kind of winters that made Europe's worst seem like a brisk picnic in April. Snowdrifts the size of donkeys, winds sharp, enough to shave a beard right off your face, and temperatures plunging into numbers that politely suggest you weren't meant to survive this. So naturally, the question arose, what do you live in when you're not quite dead yet? Enter the lean-to, often mislabeled as rustic camping or desperate chance structure. The lean-to was the architectural equivalent of a shoulder shrug. You took a large rock face, tree trunk, or anything that had the decency to not fall over in a snowstorm, leaned branches against it, covered them with anything vaguely warm or waterproof, bark, moss, the regrets of poor planning, and crawled inside. Voila, you had a cozy abode that was, quite literally, one stiff breeze away from becoming firewood. Now, some of our more enterprising settlers, the ones who had experienced building things that didn't immediately collapse, employed the wigwam model borrowed, quite respectfully, or quite urgently, depending on the day, from local indigenous tribes. Wigwams, unlike our grumpy lean-to, were ingenious dome-shaped shelters made from bent saplings, layered thick with bark mats, and, most crucially, insulated. Imagine that. Insulation in the 1600s. These round, snow-resistant structures held warmth like a well-fed cat and could be assembled quickly, which was ideal because frostbite is best avoided, historically speaking. But the challenge wasn't merely in building something. It was in knowing where to build it. Too close to a river, and you'd have a floodplain ice bath by January. Too far into the forest, and wolves might become your winter roommates. Ideally, settlers aimed for a gentle southern slope, near a fresh water supply, but elevated just enough for runoff. The kind of place Goldilocks would deem just right if she hadn't frozen solid looking for it. These considerations naturally weren't always followed. There are delightful, and by that I mean delightfully disastrous, journals from early colonies indicating entire attempts at winter shelter that had to be abandoned because they soaked through in a persistent drizzle. One account from Massachusetts cheerily recounts settlers piling hay atop their houses, only to awaken under the roof after the hay fell in. Nothing says good morning like a surprise impromptu straw funeral. And that brings us, of course, to the dugout. Not the baseball kind, though in both cases, desperate folk tend to crouch in them and hope the worst passes quickly. A dugout shelter was exactly that, a modest hole in the ground, partially roofed over with logs, brush, or if you were quite lucky, hand-sawed planks. Settlers would often dig into a hillside, using the Earth's natural insulation to keep the temperature tolerable. Earth, you see, has an agreeable habit of not freezing to death with you. The first floor was often just the floor. Dirt, occasionally sprinkled with straw, if you weren't saving that for your breakfast. Interior design was mostly limited to what hadn't rotted. A fire pit sat in the middle, offering warmth and the occasional smoke-induced coughing fit. Chimneys, luxury. Many had small openings in the roof to vent smoke, ushering it out slowly, and, ever so unfortunately, sometimes ushering the snow back in. Still, these humble hideaways saved lives. They weren't pretty, they weren't comfortable, but they were just survivable enough. And in the bitter teeth of a New World winter, just survivable was honestly quite posh. As night settled in, again and again and again, settlers lay curled in their earth-lined rooms, listening to the wind shoulder past their doors like an unwanted guest. In the dark, the crackle of the fire was not just a sound, but reassurance. They had survived one more day, one more bitter, beautiful, back-breaking day, and with their shivering silhouettes bundled in homes carved from desperation and dirt, we now creak our way towards something a bit more interesting, particularly odd, and quite possibly smelly, invention that changed winter sheltering forever. Snow had a way of falling differently in 17th century New England. Not quieter, perhaps. It still muffled the world like a thick woolen shawl, but heavier, more judgmental. It didn't merely descend from the heavens. It assessed your preparedness. And if your roof sagged or your cellar froze or your drafty walls had more holes than a politician's promises, well, the snow didn't flinch. It came anyway. For settlers in the wintry outlands, most of whom had crossed oceans only to be personally insulted by sleet, shelter wasn't a comfort. It was an urgent game of architectural survival. Timber, stone, clay, sod, desperation. They used whatever material stood still long enough and didn't bite back. There's something wonderfully humble about the structures they built. The most famous of these humble masterpieces was the dugout, or, as it was affectionately known by no one, the please don't collapse while I sleep pit. Picture it. Thick forests of oak and pine stretching endlessly under pallid grey skies. Temperatures plummet. The wind hisses derisively through the trees, and along some half-frozen riverbank, a family of settlers kneel in the dirt, carving a home into the earth itself. They weren't entirely digging just to make themselves miserable. Earthen walls, you see, were excellent insulators. When lined with timber and topped with a sod-covered roof, these dugouts could hold warmth in even the bitterest nor'easters. With a little luck and a lot of smoke in your lungs from a poorly vented hearth, it could get downright toasty inside. Of course, toasty is a relative term when it's snowing sideways outside and your shoes have fused to your feet. One notable account comes from a Massachusetts settler named Ezra Balcom, who in the winter of 1651 wrote to his cousin back in Bristol, "The wolves howl from sunset till break of day, and I find myself grateful for even the dimmest embers. We have made a room from the side of a hill, and I feel it more loyal than any friend. It's touching in its chilly way, and who among us hasn't at some point found a strange intimacy with one's own roof when the weather turns cruel? These dugouts weren't just bone-warm burrows. They were symbols of a distinctly colonial optimism, the unshakable belief that one could tame a continent by digging into it like a determined mole with a hammer. And in fairness, it largely worked. Even those first Puritan pioneers, who frowned on frivolity with such enthusiasm that one suspects they scolded geese for honking too joyfully, found themselves grudgingly impressed with these earthy shelters. There's nothing like blizzard conditions to help a person rebrand living in a hole as rustic minimalism. Children slept on straw pallets. Bread was baked over stones nestled in the hearth. Snowmelt was collected in hollowed tree limbs. And while the family cow usually got better sleeping arrangements than the servant boy, everyone made it through, so long as the walls held and no one sneezed too hard. Of course, not all shelters were dugouts. Some families went above ground, believing in the elegance of vertical ambition. They built tiny one-room cabins with thatched roofs and chimneys that belched enough smoke to send signals to every deer within 3 counties. These cabins looked charming in sketches and cold in real life. Contrary to popular Hollywood portrayals, most weren't log cabins. Axework of that quality was hard to come by. Many cabins were a patchwork of planks, mud, moss, and prayer. Windows were rare, and insulation was often provided by stuffing every available crevice with rags, animal hair, and, on particularly desperate days, children's discarded homework written on birch bark. The struggle to survive wasn't just about staying warm. It was about staying possible, preserving morale through months of darkness and boredom so thick it could arguably be chewed. There were no smartphones, no television, and no Pinterest boards filled with whimsical cottagecore winter goals. There were only stories, songs, and arguments about which uncle was snoring loudest. The winter world shrank to 4 walls and a fire, and in that tiny universe, the mundane became sacred. Evenings were devoted to mending, carving spoons, telling ghost stories that creaked like the wind outside, and watching the fire swallow another stick of precious kindling as if it were doing you a favor. And yet, in these tight, earthen shelters, there was a kind of magic. Not the dazzling magic of palaces or wizardry or indoor plumbing, but the quieter sort. The magic of persistence, of figuring it out, of waking up a little warmer than you feared you might. Soon enough, the snow would begin to melt, reluctantly, as if offended by your continued existence. And with it, new challenges would arrive, dripping steadily through the roof. But that, as always, is another tale purposely left slightly ajar. As the pale dawn light crept through the skeletal silhouettes of bare trees, The snow crunching beneath worn colonial boots took on a rhythm, slow but determined. These were not soldiers, not farmers, not even trappers, though they may have wished for that level of rustic glamour. No, these were simply families. Men, women, and children bundled in layers of linen and hope, migrating inch by inch through unforgiving terrain in search of a it'll-do shelter before winter locked its icy jaw. It was December of 1710 in the northern reaches of New Hampshire, though calling it New Hampshire was generous. At that time, it could just as well have been labelled a large frozen mistake we've committed to. The colonial authorities had encouraged settlement valiantly, as if cheerful pep talks could outmatch frostbite. But it was here, in one of the many unnamed hamlets fading among the pines and snowdrifts, where settlers devised one of the most delightfully nonsensical and oddly effective forms of winter shelter yet. Enter the frost barn. Now, this was not a barn for livestock. No cows trudged into it. No hay was perfumed with the scent of good intentions. The frost barn, a term more whispered than recorded, was a hastily constructed log frame that mimicked a barn's form, but wore the soul of a desperate lean-to. Why were these settlers building barns not for livestock, but for themselves? Because in the bitter gamble of frontier life, livestock were optional. Dying of exposure was not. You see, the timber frame cabin took time, days or even weeks to complete, with primitive tools and chilled fingers. But a frost barn, why that could be cobbled together in under a day, assuming you were all right with walls that leaked stories, creaked secrets, and occasionally hosted mice who considered themselves landlords. The structure leaned heavily on what historians would generously call resourceful architecture, a polite way to say logs jammed together and stuffed with frozen moss. Every family contributed what they could to the communal frost barn, be it extra fabric scraps, a single quilt, or just the boiling optimism of someone who hadn't yet faced a raccoon in their bedtime bonnet. Inside, the frost barn was an olfactory experience. Smells of sap, smoke, unwashed socks, scorched porridge, and fear mingled together in a stew of survival. Older children bunked on straw mat platforms that tilted at odd angles, while the youngest were bundled together in a cradle-sized crate borrowed from someone's failed cider venture. If you've ever wondered what it's like to sleep next to 6 people, 3 chickens, and a pot of slowly freezing stew, you're getting quite close. Yet, it worked. Or enough of it worked that people didn't immediately perish. Body heat was shared like gossip. A single fire pit at the center of the room tried its very best not to burn the whole operation down, while everyone rotated positions hourly like human rotisserie chickens, ensuring no one's toes became snow cones. Of course, as with any early American solution, there was a certain rivalry among frost barn aficionados. The Simons family, for example, insisted their moss chinking technique was superior, having innovated with cranberry glue, which, in theory, added both insulation and antioxidant benefits. Next door, the McKendricks countered with their spacious loft addition, lovingly referred to as the balcony, although it was just an abandoned grain shelf that didn't collapse. Yet, one woman, Martha Pinhook, documented the frost barn in her diary, referring to it as the Ark for when God forgets to make it rain. Her entries, while often obscured by candle wax smudges and something that might have been squash soup, reveal a surprisingly cozy take on communal winter misery. Tonight, young Timothy snored a hole in my sanity, but the frost stayed out. That's the measure of paradise now. Perhaps paradise is a relative affair. Across the bitter white landscape, more of these odd bow-legged barn shelters speckled the frontier like misunderstood sculptures. Later, when proper homes were finally constructed, most frost barns were disassembled, their logs repurposed for firewood or cobbled together into future outhouses. A gentle indignity for structures that had once held civilization together with nothing but kindling and stubbornness. But for a season, a humble, hastily built frost barn could cradle an entire community. And while the world outside whispered threats through snow-covered trees, inside, the settlers dreamed gently of warmth, spring, and a bedding arrangement that didn't include chickens. And just beyond the rise of another snowy hill, a different kind of shelter was being raised, one bearing the unmistakable scent of pine needles and architectural optimism. As winter's breath curled tighter across the North American wilderness, putting a fine layer of frost on everything from pine needles to the mustaches of fur trappers, another unsung marvel of colonial winter survival quietly made its appearance: the humble, hand-dug earth lodge. Now, these were not your average backyard gopher holes. No, imagine a circular shelter, partially sunken into the ground, framed with sturdy logs like an upside-down basket, and then plumped up with layers of sod, mud, and ambition. They looked rather like fat, sleeping turtles nestled in the snow, utterly unassuming and incidentally, surprisingly warm. Far too many settlers, in all their petticoated optimism, arrived on the continent assuming that a log cabin could be whipped up in a matter of days, as if IKEA had a pine and moss collection tucked between their bookshelf aisles. In truth, many newcomers discovered an unfortunate thing about logs: they don't obediently hop into place. And so, wiser souls, those who perhaps observed the practices of indigenous communities or who simply were more intimate with desperation, adopted the Earth Lodge method. And thank goodness too, because while snowdrifts whisper peacefully from a distance, they howl with cruel clarity once they find a way into your boots. On the icy plains of the upper Midwest, for instance, the Mandan people had for generations built sprawling earth lodges with precise architectural grace. Settlers who were fortunate enough to observe such engineering often borrowed, sometimes with permission, often without, the techniques with varying levels of success. The key components: dig down, build round, and insulate with the flaming passion of someone deeply allergic to hypothermia. Inside, it was a world apart. Picture flickering firelight bouncing from low-hung beams, the smoky scent of dried herbs and fur pelts mixing in the air, and the distant muffled wind kept firmly outside by a meter-thick wall of dirt. It wasn't glamorous, unless your definition of glamour includes root vegetables and the occasional raccoon sneaking in at night. But compared to dying of exposure, it was positively decadent. There were, of course, some design flaws. Smoke holes were rarely cooperative, and a poorly angled entrance tunnel could turn into a diabolical wind flute that kept everyone awake at 3 a.m. Some settlers tried to get fancy, adding small windows made of oiled paper or bladder. Less than ideal materials, especially if a curious squirrel decided to investigate. But whatever aesthetic crimes were committed in the name of innovation, these underground bunkers did their job. They kept people alive. Outside, the wilderness flexed its wintry muscles with snowdrifts taller than a grown man, and temperatures that could make brandy shiver. Inside, acoustic lullabies of logs creaking and stew bubbling lulled residents into something resembling contentment. The irony, of course, was that many of these settlers had come from Europe with dreams of golden fields and grand houses. Never in their wildest dreams did they imagine they'd one day huddle underground like badgers, muttering entreaties to their potatoes. Despite the difficulty of building and maintaining these earthy havens, they became, if briefly, a pocket-sized triumph of human tenacity. Some settlers even grew rather fond of them, wistfully recalling their little mud and timber fortresses years later when perched in their more civilized clapboard homes, many of which, interestingly, had far worse insulation. Historians rarely spend much time lauding the architectural beauty of dirt and logs, but the Earth Lodge deserves its place in the pantheon of practical genius. Without it, many a thumb might have snapped clean off from frostbite. Friendships were forged over shared fire duties, romances sparked while mending wall cracks, and at least one impromptu fiddle concert was held in a lodge so snug, the fiddle strings melted slightly. While these temporary dwellings melted back into the ground come spring, their memory lingered. Some settlers passed on the know-how like family recipes, with generous embellishments and a warning never to leave the smoke hole open during a blizzard. Others abandoned them as soon as the thaw set in, trading in earthy warmth for drafty ambition. Let us drift toward the next thread in our wintry tapestry, where necessity meets ingenuity in another form. The salted, barrel-bound brilliance of portable provisions, those curious culinary creations that tasted almost like food, and yet fed a frozen frontier. As late autumn tiptoed into the vast frostbitten heartlands of pre-colonial North America, many European settlers reached a special realization. Not one of those poetic transcendental realizations. No, this one was more along the lines of, we may have made some miscalculations, mainly all of them. The noble dream of rustic homesteading, with snow gently pattering on the roof while one knits by the hearth, quickly gave way to panic-fueled improvisation. Imagine, if you will, dozens of hopeful families standing ankle-deep in snow, holding blueprints for homes they'd meant to finish before the first frost, and realizing two small but rather important things. There was no roof, and the squirrels had absconded with the last of the cornmeal. Yet amid the flurry of mild doom, a quiet hero stepped forward. Not a man, but a method. The dugout. One part glorified hole in the ground, one part life-saving shelter. The dugout was the winter equivalent of crawling back to bed and pulling the covers over your head. Except your bed was 6 feet underground and smelled faintly of moss. Settlers, newly disillusioned with above-ground optimism, discovered that by digging into a hillside, they could leverage nature's insulation. Earth, it turns out, holds warmth in the most admirable silence. Now, these weren't glamorous dens. There were no dainty curtains, and central heating was strictly defined by proximity to the fireplace and how many layers of wool you could stack before toppling over. Many of these shelters, known colloquially as sod houses, or in prairie parlance, soddies, were quite literally patched together from turf. Thick clods of grass, soil, and the occasional disagreeable root system. But this organic camouflage worked wonders. From the outside, your winter home might resemble a modest hillock, or perhaps the secret entrance to a Tolkien-adjacent eco-village. Inside, however, it was an earthy womb, a place where frost was kept politely at bay by inches of dirt, ingenuity, and sheer pioneer stubbornness. One particularly clever tactic involved pairing dugouts with whatever the settler had on hand. Fallen branches, spare planks, and occasionally a door that had once been intended for the real house served as roofing. Some inventive folks used buffalo hides stitched together and laid them over crude wooden frames, thus keeping both the cold and the suspicious eye of passing wildlife from peeking in. And while the architectural elegance of these shelters was, shall we say, minimal, they were surprisingly strong. A well-built dugout could resist gale-force prairie winds better than some of the cabins that were, quite regrettably, assembled with enthusiasm but very little engineering. The walls, formed by the very earth itself, hugged the family inside like a moody grandparent, gruff but ultimately protective. Life inside one of these earth shelters was intimate, and by intimate, we also mean damp. Humidity was a frequent companion, often joined by small beetles, with a vague sense of boundary issues. But in exchange for a few earthy neighbours and a leaky corner or two, families stayed alive, warm, relatively safe, nestled into the ground like seeds waiting for spring. Evenings would be lit by modest lantern flame, and suppers were humble affairs, cornmeal gruel, jerky, and if it was a good day, a pie made almost entirely of imagination and boiled tree bark. But the stories flowed easily, wrapped in blankets and surrounded by the hum of the wind muffled by thick sod walls. Children fell asleep to the scent of damp soil and flickering shadows, their dreams woven with hopes for warmer mornings. And here's where history gets particularly charming. According to some accounts, when spring arrived and the families emerged blinking into the sunlight like slightly disgruntled moles, some found they hadn't fared so badly at all. Indeed, a handful of folks decided that their organic burrows were just fine for another year or 2, or 10. After all, a shelter that withstood January in Kansas deserved a little respect, and probably a name. In some settlements, dugout dwellings became semi-permanent, passed down briefly through generations until someone wealthy enough to own a sawmill came along and introduced the scandalous notion of vertical housing. Until then, home was a whole, and it was good. As the snow outside settles gently into silence, we now turn our gaze toward how one especially strange winter forced settlers to invent an even stranger solution. A solution that involved cow dung, frozen mud, and a remarkable disregard for conventional building practices. If you ever find yourself trudging knee-deep through imaginary frontier snow with an imaginary axe over your shoulder, and I truly hope, for your dream's sake, that you do, you might begin to appreciate the peculiar genius of a man named Benjamin Church. Now, no relation to anybody's actual church, lest you start picturing pews in pine forests. No, Benjamin Church was a colonial ranger in the late 1600s, known for inventing practical solutions that weren't so much flashy as they were remarkable at keeping human beings less frozen and more alive. You see, Church had a knack for adapting to wilderness. One might even say he invented a sort of rustic proto-glamping that helped early militia and settlers survive during winters that made your Aunt Carol's complaints about the thermostat seem positively tropical. During King Philip's War, a brutal and terribly named conflict that sounds more like a chess game than a blood-soaked standoff, Church realized one simple truth. Traditional British methods for shelter building were about as useful in a New England blizzard as a cannoli in a canoe. So, he looked around, observed quietly, took notes from local indigenous tribes who were, let's be honest, winning at winter. They had wigwams and longhouses, housing models that actually leaned into the climate rather than acting surprised by it every December. Church and his men began to construct what became known among his crew as earth huts or snug holes, depending on who you asked and how many teeth they still had. It wasn't fancy. You dug into the ground, stacked logs tight across the roof, and daubed the whole thing in mud, moss, and good intentions. The roof sat low. The warmth stayed in. Rain and wind politely stayed out. And inside it smelled like dirt, pine, and the unforgettable scent of unwashed soldiers in wool, which at least was better than the outside scent of death via freezing. Some of these huts were built partially into natural depressions, little scooped-out cradles in the landscape where frost liked to settle, but so did warmth if you trapped it with care. Once snow started falling, they'd shovel extra drifts up the sides of the structure. Yes, they actually insulated their homes. With more winter, frontier irony at its finest, it wasn't just about not dying. Inside these lumpy earth shelters, life ticked on in small, patient ways. By candlelight or the flicker of a bark-fed fire, they would sew buckskin mittens with clumsy fingers, sharpen their tools, twice as careful not to nick a frozen digit, and tell stories so exaggerated, Paul Bunyan would have blushed behind his ox. The acoustics, by the way, of these low-ceilinged underground sanctuaries were perfect for storytelling. Every tall tale, occasionally featuring raccoons of suspicious intelligence or snowdrifts taller than their horses, was folded into the tight dirt walls and frozen there among soot-stained rafters. Now, it should be noted, there was one slight issue. These shelters had very limited vertical clearance. Stand up too fast, and you'd learn exactly what a skull meeting of frozen log feels like. This is likely how the settlers were reminded, daily, that humility is good for the soul, and that cleverness never excuses you from a proper stoop. And so, Church and his winter-wise companions stayed alive not by brute survival alone, but by adapting, by listening, and by being just clever enough to realize that no amount of European pride could outwit a January storm in Massachusetts. Their shelters weren't pretty. They wouldn't get you likes on whatever colonial version of social media might have existed. Likely a carved birch bark note passed around at the trading post, but they worked. They kept the cold mostly out, and the hot, mushy stew mostly in. And in the war against frostbite and despair, that counted as victory. Of course, this was neither the first nor the last time settlers borrowed brilliance from the people who'd been here long before them. That quiet borrowing, sometimes respectful, sometimes, let's say less so, is a recurring theme in the saga of surviving brutal winters with only sharp sticks and suspect optimism. But for now, let us stretch out by the memory of a fire beneath the earth, wrapped in stitched hides, heads bowed slightly to avoid the ceiling beam of humility. Sleep drifts in slow, like snow on pine boughs, and somewhere not too far away, the next shelter rises, this time shaped like a sod-covered dome on the treeless plains of Dakota. But that, dear listener, is where our journey picks up next. Curiously enough, some of the earliest winter shelters that saved settlers' lives weren't even built by settlers at all. In fact, they were borrowed, adapted, or, if we're being generous, respectfully stolen from people who had already spent centuries figuring out how not to freeze to death every time the snowflakes fell just so. Enter the snow-smothered North American forest of the 1600s, a landscape so frigid and windswept that even the squirrels wore disappointed expressions. European newcomers, fresh from the cobblestone comfort of old-world inns and drafty stone manors, quickly realized something. Their imported blueprints and thick coats might keep out a London drizzle, but against a nor'easter in what would one day be called Maine, they were about as useful as a screen door on a canoe. So eyes wide from cold and desperation, many settlers began looking rather hopefully at their indigenous neighbors, people who not only didn't die each winter, but seemed relatively unbothered by it. This is where the concept of the wigwam comes waltzing in, stage left. Now, if you've only seen them in glimpses of old dioramas or history books, with that distinct smell of crayon and regret, allow me to paint a warmer picture. The wigwam, used by Algonquian-speaking peoples, was a domed structure built low to the ground and covered in bark or woven mats. Inside it was, not kidding, actually cozy. The curved walls helped trap warmth. A fire burned safely in the center, and thick layers of fur and reeds padded the floors better than any imported rug. It was the architectural equivalent of a hot cup of broth with excellent insulation. The early settlers, dwarfed inside their towering, poorly ventilated log constructs, began taking notes. By taking notes, of course, I mean subtly copying the wigwam design for their own emergency shelters, when their own timber lodges fared more like wind tunnels with a fireplace. But perhaps the coziest innovation the settlers began embracing, albeit slowly, grumpily, and with a certain amount of pride swallowing, was earth sheltering. Dig a hole, mound it with soil, line the inside with logs, and thus was born the Depression dugout, an undeniably muddy, undeniably warm solution to the cold. These subterranean hideouts were essentially human-sized root cellars with aspirations. Sure, they had very poor lighting and the ceilings dripped slightly when you thought about them too hard, but in the winter, they were nothing short of smothered brilliance. The deep insulation of the earth stabilized the temperature year-round, and while they lacked what most politely call ventilation, they made up for it by not being dead of exposure. One particularly poetic example comes from a Swedish settler in New Sweden. Not Sweden, mind you, but that tiny colonial experiment along the Delaware River. This gentleman, improvising in a land that refused to bend to polite Scandinavian sensibilities, built a half-buried timber hut, layered it with sod, and promptly snuggled in for the cold months like a bearded mole. His journal entries from the time are mostly about his nose freezing in the outhouse, and his joy at discovering moss makes a rather serviceable window plug. He, like many others, learned that staying alive in winter wasn't about valiant architecture. It was about being small, low to the ground, and sneakily adaptable, sort of like a winter vole. If the vole also brewed beer and wrote semi-legible letters to Europe. But for all the humble ingenuity of earth huts, bark shelters, and wigwam reproductions gone slightly lopsided, no winter refuge compared in durability or internal peace to the so-called trader's trapper's hut, which we will explore shortly. A one-room marvel made mostly of muscle, mud, and enough bear grease to season a decade of cast-iron dreams. And as the winds grew fiercer under the howling moon and frost clung stubborn to every branch, it was these rough-hewn shelters, borrowed, buried, or barely upright, that cradled their weary creators gently through the nights. Of all the tools early settlers brought with them, axes, kettles, stubborn optimism, perhaps the most vital of all was an unshakable belief that stacking enough logs together would fend off both bears and frostbite. It was in this spirit of enthusiastic improvisation that the Yankee settlers of northern New York developed what they gleefully called knob hutches. To modern ears, it sounds like either a new hipster restaurant or something impolite one should not bring up during dinner. But in 1795, it was simply a way to survive. Picture a huddle of settlers, shivering more out of surprise than cold as the first snow turned their makeshift lean-tos into damp memories. The trees had been generous, yes, but so had the wind. And it turned out that loosely arranged twigs and blind pioneer optimism were not great insulation strategies, so they adapted. The knob hut, sometimes called a button cabin by those who enjoyed linguistic whimsy, was a circular shelter built entirely underground, with only the entrance and a small chimney poking above the surface, like a mole's front door. The wisdom here was as practical as it was poetic. The secret to surviving winter was to become one with the earth. Digging such a hut was a communal effort, not because of some lofty ideals about shared labour, but because one simply could not dig a usable hole in frozen ground alone without either going mad or ending up with a grave. So, neighbours gathered, took turns hacking at stubborn tundra with wooden spades, and shared coffee made from roasted acorns. Because coffee beans, like California and reliable maps, were still things of the distant future. Once the hole was dug deep and wide enough, tree limbs were laid over the top in a radiating pattern, tied together with sinew or, in more prosperous settlements, horsehair twine left over from an unfortunate attempt at violin making. The entire structure was then insulated with branches, soil, and whatever future compost was available. The result was something slightly roomier than a badger den and only marginally less welcoming. But it retained heat like a hearth, and in the wilderness, being warm together beat being elegant but frozen. The strangest thing was how quickly prestige emerged. In 1800, having a knob hut with a pine needle floor and a dedicated corner for pickled rutabagas meant you were on the up and up socially. There were even rumours of a man named Jonas Bell Whittle who had carved decorative moulding around his fire hole. No one ever saw it, of course, because the hut had no windows and dim oil lamps at best. But he bragged just enough to suggest a florid sensibility and perhaps too much time spent near whale oil fumes. Inside, life settled into a slow rhythm of stewing things and not freezing to death. The lows. Ceilings meant tall folk had permanent neck aches, but even that was better than the alternative. Children made toys out of bark and the bones of long-forgotten dinners, which entertained them until some poor uncle stepped on one. Families developed a whole choreography of movement, ducking, pivoting, and nodding apologetically as they passed each other in that tight earthen waltz. And though the shelters lacked glamour, no curtains, no chandeliers, no guest rooms, they fostered kinship. People talked more, perhaps because they couldn't leave. Stories became heat of a different kind, warming hearts while frost etched delicate ferns into the wooden lintels. Nights were long, but so were the stories. Ghosts, giants, and once, rather hauntingly, a haunted giant ghost named Bertram, who only appeared during molasses season. Scent was also a permanent companion, not all of it delightful. Smoke tended to linger low, combing through the air like a meddlesome aunt, but it mixed with the sweetish notes of root vegetables and desperation, producing a perfume only beloved by those who survived it. And survive they did, not all wiser, but all a bit humbler. For what these knob huts lacked in beauty, they made up for in shelter. The earth held them kindly, warming them like a forgotten blanket rediscovered during the cruelest month. They emerged come spring blinking, pale, and profoundly grateful for rafters that did not leak, and the hallways in which one could finally stand upright. As the snows began to melt, dripping like the sky's own version of a farewell letter, some families planted flowering beans near their temporary hovels. A ritual, they said, to thank the ground for its hospitality. Next, we'll wander a little westward, through forests where acorns sparked a semi-delicious revolution, when settlers, desperate for bread, turned to the mighty oak's humble seeds and invented one of history's sleepiest muffins. Whichever shoulder you sleep on, one thing is certain. In the winter of 1797, most folks on the Ohio frontier were one heavy snow from becoming unfortunate footnotes in colonial town ledgers. under a category they never imagined. Something grim, like died of optimism. They had arrived from the east with little more than woolen dreams and pamphlets handed out by men in waistcoats who swore that the wilds of the Midwest were just waiting for polite company. Fertile lands, the ads had read. Timber for all, they promised. What they failed to mention was that fertile lands need shovels, timber needs axes, and snow doesn't negotiate. So while some settlers planned ambitious barns and orchard groves by springtime, others, those with a touch more sense or perhaps just more experience with hypothermia, were quietly constructing winter shelters of a humbler, wiser nature. These weren't grand log manors with porches and parlours. No, these were dugouts, earth houses, partially submerged into hillsides disguised as overgrown mounds with only a crooked chimney poking up like a shy badger. Some called them soddies, others half-faced camps, though that makes them sound like villains in a Shakespearean tavern brawl. In truth, these dwellings were the start of what we'd now call eco-conscious minimalist living, except damper, and with possums. The soil was both insulation and inconvenience. On cold nights, the walls held the heat like a tender secret. On rainy ones, they tried to drown you. Many a settler would sit at their crude hearth, sipping watery cornmeal gruel, while the wind howled and the moss on their ceiling slowly grew a beard. Inside, furnishings were thrifty at best. A table made from a repurposed sled, benches that doubled as firewood, beds that were mostly piles of deerskins and hope, and illumination that came from tallow candles with flames as fickle as a teenager in love. But it was enough. Enough to read a page or two of Psalms, or to patch worn socks, or simply to gaze at the orange glow and pretend, just for a moment, that you did not live in a sedimentary igloo. And yet, these modest huts were the unsung heroes of survival. Whole families, and I mean extended ones, with teenage cousins and adrift uncles, lived in spaces not much larger than a modern garden shed. Privacy wasn't just a luxury. It was a concept most children learned about years later, when someone explained it to them using hands and a whisper. One remarkable shelter, documented outside Marietta, Ohio, had 13 people living in it for 4 months. And that's not counting the chickens who had unionized by the second week. According to diary snippets, written in smudged graphite and hopeful sarcasm, the family developed a rotation system. By day, some chopped wood, some snared rabbits, and some just walked in circles to fend off cabin fever. By night, everyone packed in like firewood, elbows tucked, knees curled. The family motto essentially being, "We're not dead yet." They passed time with whispered stories, riddles, even sewing competitions. Little Martha Cobb, age 6, reportedly sewed 14 handkerchiefs in January alone, either due to an incredible work ethic or a chronic cold, possibly both. Despite the crude conditions, illness was less rampant than one might imagine. The earth-insulated walls kept temperatures stable, and the smoke from the ever-crackling fireplaces warded off more than just frostbite. It discouraged bacterial freeloaders too. The phrase "smoke-cured child" may not be medically approved, but in those winters, it was oddly accurate. Of course, when spring finally crept up like a bashful deer, most settlers staggered blinking into the sun, pale as flour and equally dusty, ready to finally build proper homes. But many looked back at their sod-roofed hobbit holes with unexpected affection. They had survived after all, not by conquering the land with axes, but by humbling themselves to its curve. They had, in essence, buried themselves just enough to stay alive, and there's something poetic in that. Sometimes the wisest move is not to stand taller than the storm, but to lean into the hill and let the earth hold you. Now, as the smoke thins and the last embers whisper secrets known only to moss and clay, we quietly wonder, what about those who couldn't dig into the ground, who had only canvas and faith against wind and snow? Let's follow them next, shall we? You'll need your coziest blanket. Snowflakes whispered across the heather, tumbling gently over twisted treetop shadows and the faint memory of a frozen footprint. As the year turned its face toward deepest winter, the early settlers of North America found themselves flanked on all sides by a foe more unshakable than politics, raccoons in the pantry, or even the great pig shortage of 1623. Yes, this enemy was cold. Not just, oops, I forgot my gloves cold, but bone-dwelling, soul-wrinkling. Why? Does the tea freeze the moment I pour it? Cold. For many colonists fresh from the cobbled streets of Europe, surviving a New World winter was like participating in a reality show where the prize was not dying. They arrived expecting things to work the same way they had back home. Build a house, find some turnips, complain about turnips. But the New World's weather had other plans, and the earliest of shelters were laughably unprepared. Some resembled soggy haystacks, others resembled soggy haystacks with walls. And then came the dugout. The dugout, not the baseball kind, mind you. Nobody had invented either baseball or the foam finger yet. No, this dugout was less sports enthusiasm and more please don't freeze to death. It was often the very first form of human architecture employed by settlers arriving with little more than a dented pot and some hope in their satchels. The concept was ruthlessly simple and cosmically humble. Find a hill, dig into it, and make it habitable. In that order, preferably. The earth itself became the walls. A collapsing ceiling could double as a blanket, though ideally, one aimed for sturdier results. Some of these semi-subterranean homes were reinforced with logs, moss, and animal skins, with a roof that suggested semi-permeable optimism. Inside one such shelter near the banks of the Delaware River, a makeshift family, 2 adults, 1 dog, and several extremely uncooperative Bannocks, huddled close to a stove made from repurposed ship parts. The only source of warmth, besides the dog's glow-in-the-dark enthusiasm, was a pot of stew that had been boiling since November and would likely outlive all of them. "Do not open the door," whispered Mary, the family's reigning expert in reasonable fear. Last time, Arthur stepped outside and found himself holding hands with a frostbitten squirrel. Arthur, wrapped in every article of clothing he possessed, nodded solemnly. I haven't the same since," he murmured. Neither has the squirrel. Shelters like these, sharing more architectural DNA with hobbit holes than New England cottages, were vital during the early colonial years. They were dark and low-ceilinged and smelled perpetually like damp wool and barely stable optimism. But they worked. Temperatures inside a well-insulated dugout could remain manageable, saving countless lives during the cold snaps of the 1600s and early 1700s. Anyone who emerged unsinged by hypothermia felt practically reborn, albeit a few inches shorter from all the hunching. Of course, not all dugouts were created equal. Some settlers fancied themselves Renaissance diggers and accidentally constructed slightly crooked homes that doubled as rainwater collection tanks. Others went the minimalist route and forgot essentials like ventilation, discovering quickly and dramatically that fires need oxygen, and so do people. Still, these shelters bore witness to entire winters of whispered stories, smoked meats, and desperate attempts to make hearth-shaped muffins out of sawdust and sincerity. Children played stick games by firelight. Pillows were fashioned from sacks of wheat, and creativity became a survival skill, right up there with knowing which mushrooms cause hallucinations and which cause permanent naps. And as spring tiptoed back across the frost, the settlers would poke their heads out like curious marmots, blinking at the sun, marveling that somehow, against odds and icy elements, they had made it. Later on, settlers began building more elaborate cabins, wood-frame fortresses of comfort with roofs that didn't cave, and doors that creaked in a luxurious, haunted house sort of way. But none of that could have happened without the dugout, the half-hidden womb of survival where humankind curled up, stubbornly refusing to perish. And out beyond the tree lines, in the place where wind still remembers those quiet, early winters, another kind of shelter was being imagined. One not dug into the earth, but raised just above it, like a pause in the landscape. The infamous bark-covered longhouse. By the time the first snow touched down on the rolling highlands of the Wyoming Territory in 1847, the Mormon pioneers were already counting every log, every crumb of hardtack, and every remaining shred of warmth in their fingertips. A bitter wind sang through crude gaps in hastily built cabins, and the bloated grey clouds above promised nothing but emotional distress and frostbite. It was a harsh test in improvisation, and let's be honest, human stubbornness. And yet, somehow, in that bone-cracking cold, these settlers managed to construct something that was part shelter, part survival strategy, and part architectural shrug. The dugout. It wasn't much to look at, truly. Picture half a hobbit hole, minus the charming round windows, the festive door wreaths, and any semblance of ventilation. Now, before you imagine an idyllic, earthen dwelling sprinkled with prairie wildflowers, let's set things straight. Dugouts were basically dirt caves with identity crises, carved into the side of hills or right into the flat earth when options were limited. Their roofs were usually made from sod layered over sticks, branches, frustration, and hope. If you were lucky, the walls wouldn't collapse during a heavy rain or a sneeze. Still, for all their humble features, dugouts were warm. Earth is a surprisingly cozy insulator. These shelters rarely dropped below freezing, even in the face of the unforgiving inland winter that could peel the bark off a pine tree with its icy glares alone. Inside, settlers stuffed rags into crevices, lined floors with whatever cloth or leftover hay they could scrounge up, and huddled like baked potatoes in a dirt oven. In one particularly charming instance in central Nebraska, the McCabe family, pioneers with precisely zero architectural training, built such an effective dugout shelter that their cows tried to move in. Clarabelle, the matriarch cow, was ultimately shooed out with the family's last clean broom, which thereafter smelled like livestock until late spring. Legend has it, she took her revenge by standing directly over the dugout's main air vent for 3 days. While modern insulation ventures include fiberglass, foam boards, and a litany of terms involving R-values, the earlier settlers swore by mud. Sod roofs were sliced like earthen lasagna, stacked just so, and plopped atop rudimentary log ribbing. When snow fell, it simply made the structure warmer. When it rained, things got interesting. Muddy puddles in your kitchen corner, mushrooms growing in your soup, and the constant dripping that not even a chamber pot could catch. Still, if you ignored the little things, like persistent mildew hallucinations, life in a dugout was cozy enough. In the Dakota Territory, where winds used to race across the plains with the enthusiasm of a caffeinated tornado, groups of Norwegian settlers took the dugout concept and added their own flair. Beds carved directly from dirt ledges, with buffalo hide stretched above for comfort. It was rustic minimalism at its most literal. They called them hudders, which roughly translates to, "This was a bad idea, but it's warm, so stop complaining." Despite their scruffy functionality, dugouts taught settlers a valuable lesson. If you couldn't fight nature, you could at least burrow into it and hope it didn't bite back. Meals were cooked over tiny hearths, blackened with soot, and smoke escaped through holes that doubled as stargazing portals when the wind wasn't howling like a banshee. And on long winter nights, families told stories, read the same 4 pages of the Bible over and over for entertainment, and knitted things no one needed, like woolen covers for turnips. The romantic image of the log cabin might earn all the pageant crowns in textbooks, but the dugout deserves a solid, honorable mention. A rough, mud-caked, unsung hero of frontier life. It was the kind of home that wouldn't win any aesthetic awards, but it kept toes attached and children from becoming tiny historical footnotes. Eventually, when spring thawed the earth and fresh timber became available, many families built above ground once more, emerging like sleepy moles returning to the sun. The dugouts, for the most part, caved in, were repurposed as root cellars, or disappeared beneath waving grasses. But they had done their silent, mucky duty. And somewhere beneath those windswept plains and hills, if you listen closely on a cold winter night, you might still hear the faint creak of a sod door, the laughter of families huddled in their dirt dens, and the long, defeated sigh of a broom-swinging farmer discovering that a cow has once again claimed squatters' rights. As twilight deepens and the embers of memory fade, let's drift toward a new shelter, one forged not from earth or wood, but from the forgotten cleverness of snow itself. By late December of 1704, the wind in New England no longer whistled through the trees. It growled through them, like a hungry beast annoyed that people had the nerve to survive. Snow weighed down the pine branches like gossip on a busy town crier, and even the rabbits had begun clearing out old squirrel dens and wondering which neighbor's food stash they might borrow. Out on the edge of a dense forest near the Connecticut River, huddled half beneath the earth and half above it, stood a curious sort of structure, part cabin, part burrow, and part architectural accident. Known to the few who'd ever seen it as the dug-in delight, this shelter sat lower than any sensible house and higher than any sensible root cellar. It was, by all accounts, an improvised miracle. The creators of this strange survival pod were the Brackett family, Elias, Temperance, their 3 increasingly feral children, and Uncle Radley, who at once tried to patent a hat made of birch bark and still insisted he was about to become rich any day now. When the early frost had come down like a polite but firm eviction notice from the sky, Elias had realized they wouldn't finish their proper log home in time. So with nothing but his hands, a suspiciously bent spade, and a borderline reckless enthusiasm for repurposing things, he began digging into the southern slope of a hill. You see, root cellar living was not entirely new. Back in Europe, peasants often kept vegetables in earth-cooled pits, but Elias took the concept about 4 steps further and several spadefuls deeper. He hollowed out a main room where the family could all crouch, if not stand, and lined the walls with packed mud, pine needles, and a few planks salvaged from what had once been a canoe. May it rest in peace. The roof was a marvel of frugality. Overlapping bark sheets from a fallen oak, held in place by snow and hope. Smoke escaped through a vent, thoughtfully made from a hollowed-out log, which also let in squirrels who wished to come down and critique the decor. Inside, it was tight, dim, and smelled faintly of onion, but it was warm, and in those biting weeks of windburn and frozen toes, warmth was worth all the elbow bruises and the mild humiliation of living underground like something out of a folk tale. Temperance, a woman with the steady resolve of a saint and the dry wit of someone who could split firewood with a glance, made the place downright cozy. She strung dried apple slices along the ceiling on twine and labelled storage niches with neat charcoal scribbles, beans, extra wool, and, mysteriously, "Don't touch, Radley." The children adapted with the flexibility only frontier kids can muster. By the second week, the youngest had named the family of mice in the corner. By the third, they had taught them simple tricks. Rather than fret over the tight quarters, they invented games like Guess What? This Used to Be, a thrilling competition involving cooked leftovers of uncertain origin, and Don't Let the Icicle Touch You, which ended when one of them got icicled quite hard. Uncle Radley, of course, spent most of his time producing sketches of new hat ideas or staring at the improvised hearth, muttering theories about fire and destiny. That hearth, incidentally, was nothing but a circle of stones around a perpetual stew. One of those bubbling mysteries of the early colonies where no one could quite recall when it started and no one dared stop it, for fear it was what kept the shelter held together through sheer culinary continuity. Still, for all its quirks, their wild earth winter home served its purpose. Insulated by snow and compressed humidity, it held in warmth far more efficiently than above-ground structures, which lost heat with an enthusiasm rivaled only by Radley's insistence that squirrels were hoarding gold. Word of such burrowed shelters spread in whispers, part warning, part inspiration. Some scoffed, others followed suit, because when you're ankle-deep in frost and breathless from the cold, a warm hole in the ground starts to sound less like surrender and more like strategy. And so, the brackets endured. The winter, though bitter, learned it had competition in their stubborn joy, a kind of rebellion made out of mud walls, onion-scented embers, and laughter snorted through chattering teeth. It turns out survival isn't always grand or noble. Sometimes it's just knowing how to dig low and pack tight. But as the late January winds howled to another tune, another settler, several miles north and one's surprisingly mild beard warmer richer, was attempting his own peculiar innovation in winter shelter design, somewhere near the border of what is now eastern Minnesota, where pine forests sigh in their sleep and icicles form like cathedral chandeliers over hibernating streams. A small group of Swedish immigrants once fashioned one of the strangest and most successful winter shelters on record. It was part log cabin, part upturned boat, and entirely the product of desperation mingled with just enough creative madness to work. It began, as many curious winter tales do, with an accident involving a sled, a frozen lake, and one man's refusal to admit that he was, in fact, lost. Lars Pettersson, a second son, and therefore not the inheritor of anything more than a somewhat defective compass, had guided his little party of 6 settlers into a region he swore was just 10 more miles to the trading post. It wasn't. The lake he insisted was frozen rock solid turned out to be only rock solid in patches, and the canoe he lashed to the top of the sled just in case would soon become the roof of their winter salvation. After their sled cracked through a thin sheet of ice with a noise described in journals as like God unstapling the sky, the group staggered to shore, cold, wet, and dripping with equal parts meltwater and disillusionment. Now, dear listener, there's a particular kind of genius that visits people only when the temperature drops and all hope seems to be digging itself a tunnel to China. And on that frosty afternoon, genius paid a peculiar visit to Lars and his companions. They dragged the canoe, hand-built back in Stockholm from Baltic pine and personal hubris, onto a rise above the flooded woods. Then, flipping it over like an enormous soup bowl, they propped it on stilts of thick birch, wove a wall of pine boughs around the perimeter, and packed every crack and crevice with mud, moss, and denial. They built a fire pit in the center, carefully vented with a hollowed spruce log shoved artfully up through what had once been the canoe's stern. Inside, the shelter was tight, cozy, and smelled heavily of fish, tar, and unspoken grievances. But it was warm, and that, in the biting lunar glare of a northern December, was no small accomplishment. They slept shoulder to shoulder on beds of pine needles and sheepskins, speaking in hushed tones about life back home, the dubious trajectory of their current expedition, and, on more optimistic nights, recipes remembered from their mothers' kitchens. Every evening, one person was in charge of the flickering center fire, which served not only to warm their toes, but also to keep sausages from freezing into medieval weapons. During one particularly brutal cold snap, so cold that, as one survivor claimed, your breath weighed more than your boots, the canoe cabin performed beautifully. Icicles dripped off the roof's edge like delicate punctuation marks. Outside, wolves howled some ancient equation of hunger and harmony. Inside, the settlers read aloud from a surviving copy of Pilgrim's Progress, sang lullabies, played low games of cards, and sighed deeply into mugs of birch tea. And yes, because you might be wondering, frostbite was still very much a possibility, but tucked inside their upside-down nautical nook, they claimed to feel a resilience borrowed from Norse sagas and fairy tales with slightly menacing trolls. Local Ojibwe neighbors took interest in the peculiar construction. After a leisurely but pointed conversation conducted through gestures, broken Swedish, and generous trade gifts, the canoe house party learned more efficient ways to insulate their shelter, recognize edible winter roots, and avoid being flattened by falling snow from conifer boughs. The cultural exchange was, by all accounts, kind, awkward, and seasoned liberally with hand gestures involving imaginary reindeer. Of course, nothing about this temporary shelter made it into textbooks. There are no markers at the site, no reconstructions in museums. Only a few journal entries survive, tucked into private archives, written in slightly smudged cursive that seems to say, "We didn't die, and also we may have invented winter glamping." But for a brief moment, somewhere outside of maps, but well inside the protected chambers of human ingenuity, a group of weary souls lived under the upturned belly of possibility, and they stayed warm. Now, as the fire grows low and the stars above their canoe-roofed haven blink slowly into place, let's follow the snow-blown trail eastward, where another unlikely structure waits, hewn from stone, stuffed with hay, and shaped like, well, it's best if you see it for yourself. In the frostbitten wilderness of colonial New England, where the trees had the audacity to groan in the wind, and even the rivers seemed to mutter threats beneath sheets of ice, settlers began to discover a curious truth. The best winter shelter might not be a log cabin, but a hole in the ground. And yes, dearest listener, tonight we burrow into the humble, underappreciated world of the dugout. Now, before you scoff, because holes are generally things one falls into, not thrives within, let's pause and consider the brilliance of ancestral practicality. You see, when you don't have sawn timber, a skilled carpenter, or say any inclination to freeze to death, you get creative with what you have. A shovel, a blanket, and rude determination. The dugout, despite sounding like something reserved for badgers and outlaws, was a genuine lifesaver on the American frontier. These were semi-subterranean shelters, scooped into hillsides or sunken into open fields, roofed with sod, logs, or anything settlers hadn't yet burned for firewood. Inside, temperatures stayed surprisingly mild. Outside, wolves howled their disappointment, unable to huff, puff, and blow these earthen hovels down. It may comfort you to know that this innovation wasn't purely a backwards invention. Oh no, humans have been living inside hillsides since we were more hair than hat maker. The clever thing about being underground is insulation. And nothing insulates like damp soil hugging your walls like a shy but affectionate mole. One especially marvelous example comes from the Dakota Territory in the 1860s, where winters were cruel enough to make ice jealous, and settlers were thin on supplies, thinner on patience. In his diary, one settler wrote, "Our home is mostly mud, but it is our mud, and it is warm." That may be the first time someone bragged about living in what was, arguably, a root cellar they cooked in. Imagine a family of 7 huddled in a single-room dugout, the walls packed with sod, the ceiling held up by whatever branch-shaped things weren't already on fire. By candlelight, they'd sip substitute coffee, often chicory, sometimes corn, and slowly, gloriously unthaw their fingers. The children would sleep together under buffalo hides or, more commonly, one exceptionally itchy wool blanket. Meanwhile, the family goat, if they had one, might bed down inside too. This wasn't due to affection, per se, but because a goat acts as a 4-legged hot water bottle with hooves. And in the land of hypothermia, that's love. The roof, now that was always a gamble. It might be earth and twigs, or perhaps a literal sod layer, turning rooftop gardening from a luxury into a suburban inevitability. Rain caused leaks, snow caused collapse, wind made the walls whisper. But in the quiet moments, these shelters could feel oddly magical, like the world above had vanished, and all that remained was warmth, smoke curling from makeshift chimneys, and the rhythmic thud of bread dough meeting the makeshift counter. Speaking of smoke, chimneys were sometimes nothing more than a gap in the roof, with the optimistic hope that heat would rise and smoke would follow it. It would not always. Many a settler emerged red-eyed, not from emotion, but from clever architectural choices. On windy days, the smoke blew back inside and coated every corner of the dugout until everyone looked like they'd been gently rolled in charcoal. Still, let us not mock the dugout too much. It kept people alive when survival was not guaranteed. It asked for little and gave much. One might enter it starved, shivering, threadbare with doubt, and wake up, if not smoke-choked, just a little closer to spring. And while others staked their hopes on grand cabins or dreams of imported bricks, those in the know looked to the soil beneath their feet. The ground did not lie. It only asked that you dig a little deeper. Of course, as the years went on and settlements grew sturdier, dugouts got quietly phased out. People opted for wooden homes, insulation, charming chimneys. But every now and then, beneath someone's garden or beside an old hill, forgotten remnants of these earthen havens still sleep beneath the sod, like cozy time capsules filled with soot, buttons, and the faint memory of warmth. And while those shelters may be gone, the ingenuity they represented still whispers in the wind. Now, as we nestle into that image, a quiet dugout glowing faintly in a sea of snow, let's drift toward the next fireside mystery. How a peculiar and now extinct form of mittens may have been the determining factor in who chopped the most firewood, and who merely napped near it, somewhere around the wintry cusp between desperation and accidental innovation. Early settlers in the snowbound corners of colonial North America discovered what might now be called woodland retirement plans for the recently frostbitten. Entire families, layered like onion soups, began fashioning a little-known but surprisingly effective kind of winter shelter, the dugout cabin, a structure so humble it made igloos look boastful. Unlike log cabins, which demanded timber, time, and the stamina of a particularly peppy mountain goat, dugouts could be built in mere days, or more accurately, chipped into reluctant existence by settlers who suspected frostbite had already claimed their ankles. The premise was marvelously simple. Find a south-facing slope, preferably one that didn't already belong to a bad-tempered badger, excavate a cave-shaped cavity into the earth, and line the interior with whatever you had on hand, or foot, sometimes logs, sometimes dry turf, occasionally pure optimism. To fortify the roof, they would stretch saplings across the top like ribs across a chest cavity, then thatch the gaps with branches, sod, and enough snow to hoodwink nature into thinking it had already buried them. It was primitive, yes, but after a few frost nips and a disastrous flirtation with sleeping in hollowed-out tree stumps, most settlers would have cozied up to an oven mitt if it promised to block the wind. Within these earthen wombs, families huddled in cramped, smoky intimacy, the air thick with stale breath, boiling gruel, and occasional arguments over lost mittens. Chimneys were optional. So were windows. Settler folk learned that darkness could be surprisingly cozy when weighed against the indignity of losing toes. Indeed, having a single candle flickering in the dugout was a luxury, both for the light and for the tiny bit of perceived civilization it offered. And yet, somehow, these rugged burrows worked. They soaked in warmth. Earth, after all, is a rather considerate thermal mass. It doesn't fluctuate wildly like your cousin Barbara's mood after tea. No, soil stays slow and steady, cradling warmth inside its belly and shielding its weary guests from the piercing tantrums of February wind. Ingenuity bloomed in the darkness. Beds were layered with straw and covered with patchwork quilts that looked like a sewing accident, but felt like victory anyway. Meat was smoked, or salted, or simply stared at until it surrendered to the cold. Ice would form in water pails just a foot from the hearth, but that too became part of the rhythm. Just another rustic inconvenience to talk about during silent meals, or to explain to visiting birds why they weren't welcome inside. In the Dakota Territory, indigenous tribes had already mastered the earthen lodge long before pale settlers arrived. These were dugouts with good posture and cultural dignity, carefully planned, artistically layered with willow, grasses, and adobe mud. Many settlers learned from these homes, though they rarely gave credit, of course. But historical hindsight has a generous way of circling back, like a boomerang made of gratitude. Interestingly, as spring approached and frost gave way to hopeful puddles, many settlers found themselves reluctant to abandon their subterranean sanctuaries. Sure, they were cramped. Yes, you might inhale 5 people's worth of socks in a single breath, but they were warm, forgiving, and largely immune to tornadoes. Besides, building a real house meant felling trees, hauling lumber, and pretending you were excited about constructing a proper outhouse. Still, each dugout had its season. Eventually, the ground would soften, the mud would misbehave, and the charm of living like a potato would wear thin. So, families crawled from their caves, blinking into spring like startled marmots, ready to lay foundations and pretend the whole thing had been intentional. There are records, scrawled in journals, scribbled in fading ledgers, of these little winter wombs keeping families alive, warm and weirdly hopeful through some of the harshest winters on record. They don't get statues. Tourists don't pose inside replica dugouts for holiday postcards. But maybe that's fitting. Maybe they're meant to be quiet achievements, secrets between settlers and soil. And so the story continues, emerging from the dugout's earth-scented hush into a new chapter, airy and sunlit, where chimneys rise, neighbors visit, and dreams at last stretch beyond the frostbitten threshold. Somewhere in the unbothered cold of the Allegheny Mountains, beneath a heavy sky stitched with stars, a settler named Lemuel Whitaker carved a wooden spoon by candle glow inside what was, from the outside, a very unimpressive pile of mud and moss. To a passing woodland creature, or possibly a confused French fur trapper, it appeared to be an unsuccessful attempt by the earth to grow a bread loaf. But to Lemuel, it was shelter. And not just any shelter. It was a snug hut. Now, the word snug hut was never officially coined by any governing body, but that hardly matters since Lemuel invented it one bitter January evening, while muttering to his oxen that he'd simply freeze into a bootsicle if he didn't do something clever and small-statured. And so, with a little ingenuity, a lot of tree bark, and the sort of cold-induced clarity one only gets when icicles are nipping at their britches, the snug hut was born. It was less grand than a log cabin and markedly less flimsy than a tent, existing comfortably in that sweet architectural in-between, the hibernation chic of early survival design. Lemuel's first rule of snug hut construction: headroom was optional, warmth was not. He began by digging slightly into the hillside, just enough to insult a mole's pride, and then packing the lower half with straw, river stones, and the sort of damp optimism only the deeply chilly possess. The roof was thatched with overlapping bark, pine branches, and wishful thinking. The door was a repurposed cupboard from a cart that had conveniently broken in just the right way. In fact, it still retained a faint scent of pickled cabbage, which Lemuel decided must be what comfort smells like. Inside, things were intimate. If you stood up too fast, you'd meet the ceiling with your forehead. If you breathed too heavily near the candle, the walls sweat a little. But in a land where the snow howled like a judgmental auntie and ice formed inside one's boots, the snug hut was king. And Lemuel, who previously had all the architectural sensibilities of a spoon, was suddenly regarded among the settler community as a sort of wintry wizard. Other families began scrapping plans for proper cabins and instead begged Lemuel to help them erect similarly squat, cozy shacks. He became something of a local celebrity, not on the scale of, say, inventing the wheel, but definitely in the realm of man didn't frostbite himself to death using dirt and twigs. Acclaim. What's particularly delightful is that Lemuel never intended to innovate. He wasn't trying to be clever, he was just cold. Inspiration, like soup, often bubbles up under pressure and a low flame. Elsewhere along the colonial frontier, another kindred spirit named Elvira Cranston was crafting an underground dwelling so perfectly concealed from the elements, she'd once gone 2 whole weeks without anyone realizing she was still in the valley. They thought she'd run off to join up with a group of radical Quakers. In truth, she'd just gotten really into her winter reading list and was too cozy to come outside. Elvira's hideaway was a sod-roofed half-home, half-library. Beneath the plush floor of moss and goose down, she stashed tallow candles, dried cherries, 14 pamphlets about improving one's potato yield, and 3 squirrels who didn't pay rent but contributed light conversation on occasion. The settlers who busied themselves erecting grand timber homes would scoff, until an eastward blizzard came through roaring like a tavern brawl with windburn, and Elvira's snug little sanctuary stood quiet and unshaken. More than a few noses were pressed longingly to her frosted porthole window, through which she could be seen sipping sassafras tea without a care, and without frostbite. As it turns out, winter didn't favour grandeur. It respected cunning. It warmed to humility, rewarded creative snugness, and was deeply suspicious of anyone who built homes with high roofs and wide doors that invited the cold in like an unruly houseguest. So while history might tip its hat more often to the monument builders and fort architects, let us whisper gentle praise tonight for the champions of warmth in a pinch, the snug huts, the root shelters, the cozy burrows, and humble moles who may or may not have loaned us the idea. Somewhere deeper in the pines, another hut glowed faintly with firelight, and in its centre, a small sleeping family dreamt of spring. But before spring has the final word, there's one more winter haven to discover. One made not of bark or dirt, but ice itself. The wind that wandered through the Great Plains was not entirely malicious, but it was, let's say, persistently indifferent to human suffering, especially in February, especially when your boots were 2 sizes too small and your idea of insulation involved 1 wool sock and a prayer. But snow doesn't wait for proper planning, and neither did the early settlers of Nebraska Territory. Those plucky pioneers lured westward by dreams of land, glory, and a curiously unwavering faith in their ability to conquer Mother Nature with a sunbonnet and a bread starter. Enter the sod house, Earth's original weighted blanket. By the mid-19th century, settlers crossing into the treeless expanse of the plains faced an architectural crisis. Build a home, but without wood. The few trees were treated with reverence or chopped and used up in approximately 48 minutes flat. So they turned to what was abundant: soil. Thick, fibrous, grassy prairie soil, stubborn enough to make a plow cry. These brave families began carving it into bricks. Chunks of sod, cut with special plows, each block weighing about as much as a sleepy Labrador. They were stacked like misbegotten brownies into walls, damp with determination and hope. In winter, the sod insulated like a dream, trapping heat in with admirable stubbornness. And in summer, it cooled as if the house had been laboriously constructed inside a loaf of rye bread. The soddy, as it was affectionately called, smelled vaguely of earth and livestock, which could be both comforting and alarming. You could lose a teacup in the walls if you weren't careful. And sometimes chickens would hop onto the sodded roof to peer into the chimney, curious about dinner plans. But charm, as we know, is not always tidy. Inside, life in a sod house could be surprisingly cozy. In the absence of wallpaper, imaginative homesteaders lined their walls with old newspaper and flour sacks, giving visitors the sense that they'd stepped into a reading room sponsored by the Department of Starch. Some painted the paper sections with homemade pigments, turning wild grasses and crushed berries into the world's slowest, most local paint store. During cold snaps, and in the quieter hours between chores, the family would huddle near the central stove, every joint wrapped in every scarf they'd ever known. The sound of the wind howling outside was muted by feet-thick walls of ancient roots and soil. Children recited lessons, Mothers stirred stews of questionable origin, and belts were slowly tightened in anticipation of spring planting. It was far from luxurious, but in a landscape that could turn deadly the moment clouds got ideas, it was more than enough. One visitor from Boston allegedly stayed in a plainswoman's sod home and later wrote that it was a house of earth, but warmer than any stone. He also commented on the indoor goat, but one suspects that was a household-specific feature. Of course, these structures weren't without their peculiarities. Rain could test their structural integrity, often prompting emergency repairs mid-conversation. Sometimes, little chunks would fall from the ceiling during a particularly enthusiastic thunderstorm, plopping into soup or onto unfortunate cats snoozing where they oughtn't. But more often than not, these homes endured longer than the bodies inside them, standing witness to births, blizzards, victories, and every kind of spilled coffee you can imagine. They were not mansions, but monuments, to grit, to patience, to the astonishing ability of humans to adapt. A home made from the very ground settlers trod upon, earth they'd ploughed, seeds they'd sown, storms they'd weathered, compressed into walls thick enough to outwait February. And as the century crept on and more traditional building materials reached the plains, the soddy began to disappear. Some were dismantled brick by brick, others simply collapsed and were reclaimed by the prairie grasses that had offered themselves in the first place. A few still stand today, weathered and slouching on the horizon, their lines soft, like the memory of a bedtime story you're not sure whether you heard or dreamed. In the hush of those long Nebraska winters past, you might imagine the gentle crackling of a stove, the low whisper of wind beyond a living earthen husk, a child's laughter echoing off a wall of prairie soil, and you could almost believe the home was breathing, slow, steady, and warm. Sometimes, survival isn't about grand statues or sweeping acts of heroism. Sometimes it's a front door made of sod and a stove that keeps on burning. As spring tiptoes closer, so too comes the question, what happened when winter hit the mountains, where sod was no longer an option? Well, that's another chapter, built a little steeper and just as snug. Perhaps no tale better illustrates the cold ingenuity of early American settlers than that of the cabbage hut. Not a cabbage-patched hut, which, if you're imagining children in bonnets, is an entirely different phenomenon, but an actual winter shelter beefed up with fermented vegetables and desperation. Let's drift back, not too fast, we don't want to catch a chill, to the early 1700s, in what was then still a very wild Pennsylvania. Picture it, a landscape all frosted trees and low mist, the air so still it sounds like silence just took a deep breath. Somewhere along the Allegheny frontier, a group of German-speaking immigrants faced their second, far crueler winter. Their first winter had been a flirtation. This one was a proper courtship with frostbite. The settlers had tried building traditional log cabins, sturdier than tents, of course, but thin enough in places that the wind could whistle a little concerto through the gaps. Firewood was precious, and their pigs, who had no interest in being chopped into lard just yet, were refusing to become bacon. Something had to be done. And so, relief arrived in the form of sauerkraut. The German settlers brought not just their sturdy boots and stern facial expressions, but also a deep cultural relationship with fermented cabbage. Sauerkraut was cherished not just as a tangy treat, but as a cure-all. Rumored to defeat scurvy, soothe stomachs, and possibly, with sufficient quantities, keep out the cold. Possibly. Faced with dwindling food supplies and an oncoming blizzard, the settlers had a moment that historians like to call an innovative panic. Lacking enough stone or timber, insulation, they began to stack barrels of homemade sauerkraut along the inside walls of their shelter. Rows upon rows of pungent brine-soaked cabbage packed against the drafts. Some even claimed the acidic vapor drove out nose-biting chill and nosy raccoons in equal measure. It was smelly. Oh yes, the place reeked like a pickle factory in a sauna. But oddly enough, it worked. The barrels added mass, keeping warmth inside. The fermentation process, which releases a little heat of its own, offered ambient warmth, not enough to roast chestnuts by, but just enough to outweigh hypothermia. And since sauerkraut keeps nearly forever, it doubled as part insulation, part lunch. A real cabbage-based duplex. The story of the cabbage hut spread, mostly because once someone had smelled it, they couldn't stop talking about it. Some scoffed. Others tried to replicate it. One Dutch settler reportedly tried to use pickled herring in lieu of cabbage. It did not go well. No one wanted to sleep next to a wall of fish, except maybe the local bear. Yet for those who braved the olfactory onslaught, the sauerkraut barrier kept the nights bearable. Children slept sandwiched between wool blankets and tangy barrels, dreaming harmlessly of dinner and never once of frostbite. And so the community made it through that cruel winter, nostrils permanently flared, but fingers and toes blissfully intact. As the years rolled gently forward, more conventional building methods took over again. Thicker timber, mortar, eventually glass panes, and something called personal boundaries. But the legacy of the cabbage hut lived on, whispered over mugs of cider as the ultimate example of settler pragmatism. If it smells terrible but keeps you alive, build too. We often overlook these odd moments of historical DIY survival. But as curious as it seems now, those barrels might very well have been the difference between village and ghost story. Innovation, after all, rarely smells like roses. Some say a replica of the sauerkraut shelter still stands today, tucked behind a baking museum near Scranton. Most say that's nonsense. But if you ever catch a whiff of something oddly vinegary on a winter wind, you might just be near history's most delicious winter wall. As the embers of that tale flicker low, let the warmth of its oddity sink in. After all, in the next chapter, we'll find ourselves knee-deep in snow tunnels, and possibly in marmot gossip. There's more to dig up, gently, south of the St. Lawrence, along the meandering folds of the Connecticut River Valley. Winter had an unfortunate habit of arriving early and overstaying its welcome. For early settlers, whose idea of a well-insulated home often involves stuffing moss between logs and muttering hopeful prayers, the plunging temperatures spurred not just discomfort, but genuine dread. And yet, beneath thick snowdrifts and skeletal tree limbs, snug little wonders quietly saved their lives, root cellars, earth shelters, and stone huts cleverly disguised as bumps in the scenery. Now, before we gallop too quickly into another poetic frostbite metaphor, let's zoom slowly into one particular shelter, marvelously unremarkable, and built by a man named Josiah Butterwick. Yes, Butterwick, a name that sounds like it ought to belong to a quaint tea biscuit, or perhaps a particularly buttery doorstop, but instead, he was a shoemaker turned homestead architect extraordinaire. Josiah, like many settlers of his time, had grown a touch weary of nature's seasonal attempts to freeze his socks off. His first cabin had suffered mightily one winter, when a squirrel he refused to evict had turned the roof thatch into its own private larder, and overheard conversations into midnight nut-crunching fiascos. The poor man hadn't slept in December since. With admirable resolve and about 12 cords of borrowed stone, Josiah built what he called his winter womb, a sunken shelter, carved partially into a hillside, its thick walls reinforced with clay and misappropriated church pews. Inside it was dim, silent, and smelled vaguely of onions and beeswax, which, given the era, was considered downright luxurious. The settlers of New England cottoned onto this idea with a speed one might not expect from snowbound farmers with frostbitten toes. Earth sheltering wasn't new. Indigenous peoples had long used the insulating power of Mother Nature's own soil. But to early European settlers, it felt a bit like cheating, until they realized it meant the difference between waking up cozy with a boiled turnip or waking up a historical anecdote. These shelters weren't just survivalist holes in the earth. They were humble engineering marvels. Sloped entrances prevented snowdrift pileups, while angled sun spaces captured even the laziest of winter rays. Some interiors were built in a kind of Hobbit-esque style, with rounded walls, low ceilings, and shelves for root, vegetables that were practically pampered. Little did those vegetables know they were being stored with more care than many of the children. There was, perhaps inevitably, a touch of social awkwardness around these underground retreats. Guests didn't know whether to knock or yodel. Doors constructed from wagon wheels and old barn doors creaked with the grace of a haunted ship. And since chimneys were a luxury, many settlers simply left tiny vents that doubled as both airways and squirrel highways, reminding every resident that while you could outsmart the wind, you were never out of reach of the local wildlife. Still, life in a winter shelter had its charms. If you could call learning to sleep next to a bubbling pot of fermenting cabbage charming. Families grew closer, partly out of emotional warmth and partly because there wasn't room to stand without hitting your uncle's elbow. People wrote diaries, whittled spoons, and told stories with such passion that every cracked wall and leaking clay pipe above seemed to lean in a little closer to listen. And the funny thing is, those humble shelters, half forgotten and overgrown now, probably saved more lives than we'll ever count. History has a habit of placing emphasis on the grand acts. Battles, declarations, founding documents penned with alarming flourish. But it's the quiet ingenuity of people like Josiah Butterwick, determined not to freeze to the floorboards, that often made all the difference. Outside, the snow continued to fall, insistent, soft, and ever so slightly amused. But underground, tucked beneath a crust of earth and stone, broth bubbled, lanterns flickered low, and the settlers dreamed not of escape, but of daylight and spring, and maybe a larger hut next year with less cabbage. Tomorrow would bring new problems, perhaps a chimney in need of repair, or another groundhog attempting to move in. But tonight the hearth was warm, the bed was dry, and nothing, not even history itself, could interrupt this hard-earned sleep. And when the frost grew quieter and the shadows longer, well, something curious was just beginning to stir beyond the next ridge. Winter had begun sharpening its frostbitten claws earlier than usual in the year 1771, catching settlers in New York's frontier utterly off guard, like a guest arriving 6 hours before the dinner party, and asking what's for dessert. The wind came whispering through the birch trees, not as a gentle lullaby, but with the tone of a mother-in-law offering unsolicited advice, bone-chilling and persistent. In a narrow valley, not far from what would one day become Albany, a collection of log cabins leaned shiveringly toward one another, as if huddling for warmth. the inhabitants of this tiny settlement, poor souls from Scotland and poorer decisions, had not quite mastered the art of winter preparation. It wasn't that they'd skipped food storage entirely, but rather that they mistook half a barrel of dried turnips for a robust pantry. But the true saviour of this ill-fated winter wasn't to be found in pickle jars or root cellars. No, salvation came in the form of something far humbler, far fluffier. The reed-roofed earthen sod lodge hastily constructed by one Angus Macready, a failed poet turned reluctant colonist. He'd read somewhere that covering one's shelter with grass and dirt made chilly winds considerably less chilling. And so, while others were constructing charming but utterly uninsulated cabins, picture Instagram-worthy but frostbite-friendly, Angus dug deep, both into the frozen earth and his general sense of existential dread. He built low, he built heavy, and most importantly, he built with the geometric grace of someone who had no time for aesthetics. The result? A somewhat lumpy, almost invisible mound halfway between being a house and being the hill behind it. A perfect example of architectural camouflage and profoundly successful, cozy, if unphotogenic living. When the first blizzard hit in late October, a premature arrival that locals referred to politely as a bit rude, the Macready Lodge remained stoically unaffected. Snow drifted across its roof without so much as a creak. Inside, Angus sipped pine needle tea and contemplated writing a sonnet to his damp-topped yet wonderfully warm dwelling. His neighbours were slower to appreciate his brilliance. Initially, they dismissed the structure as the place where the dirt decided to squat. But by mid-November, when cabin number 3 experienced what can only be described as a roof departure event during a spirited wind squall, attention shifted. One by one, settlers began to visit Angus under the pretense of borrowing salt or just wanting to see how the mole people live. Eventually, the Macready Lodge became a communal shelter of sorts. Angus cleared space in the corner beneath the crossbeam for Mrs. Featherstone, a widow with a relentless cough and legendary chicken stew. By December, there were 9 people, 3 chickens, and a rather expressive goat inside that earthen wonder. Privacy was scarce, warmth was plentiful, and space smelled vaguely of wool and stewed onions. But here's the secret that the history books rarely discuss. It wasn't just the sod roof and thick walls that made these shelters lifesavers. It was the sheer efficiency of shared warmth, human ingenuity, and a collective refusal to be frozen into folklore. Each earthen lodge became a cradle of whispered stories, of lullabies sung over stew pots, of people so tightly packed that they functioned like a single, slow-breathing creature hibernating under the earth. And in the course of this strange, frozen season, friendship was forged, not by grand gestures or heroic rescues, but by the passing of soup bowls and the polite ignoring of anyone's socks falling into the hearth. Even the goat contributed, occasionally pressing its forehead against someone's knee like a 4-legged hot water bottle with hooves and tragic indigestion. Angus, now unofficial mayor of this subterranean village, kept meticulous notes. Not on community regulations or food inventories, no. His records included, in poetic verse, things like number of times Mrs. Featherstone sneezed loud enough to wake the chickens, and dream log entry, Shred 17, goats can dance. Years later, when prosperity brought brick homes and real chimneys, the sod lodge survived, partly entombed by time, and partly ignored because no one wanted to tackle the goat smell baked into the walls. Archaeologists would one day excavate it and marvel at its heat-retaining design, mistaking the goat hairs for ceremonial tokens and Angus's poetry for early attempts at fireproof insulation. But while others had taken their chance with wind-struck cabins and prayer, Angus and his fellow burrowmates found glory in the dirt. And just as frost began to ease its grip and winter slowly exhaled, a soft northern breeze carried whispers of an even greater marvel. A different kind of cold-weather refuge tucked deep in the mountains, where stone did all the warming and the goats were terrifyingly absent. The snow was falling in gentle, swirling hushes across the pine-covered ridges of what settlers once called the western frontier. Though, of course, one could argue that frontier is simply another word for land already very much inhabited by native peoples who knew how to handle a frostbite-inducing blizzard. Thank you very much. By the mid-19th century, Americans were still venturing west with all the tenacity of overconfident squirrels, determined, hopeful, and only vaguely aware of how poorly things could go if they miscalculated the winter. For every romantic woodblock image of rugged log cabins spitting out chimney smoke against a wintry backdrop, there were dozens less picturesque truths, like huddling under bark-covered shelters that dripped more snowmelt than they'd shed, or roasting a single undercooked turnip while trying not to reenact the Donner Party. But necessity, that icy muse of invention, has a funny way of inspiring genius, especially when your water barrel has frozen into a solid drum and your last dry sock is doing double duty as a mitt. This was the quiet triumph of winter shelters, structures so practical and humble they were rarely celebrated, but without which many a pioneering dream would have ended in frostbitten toes and deep, regretful sighs. Take the sod dugout, for instance. There was nothing especially majestic about these half-underground rectangles, cut into hillsides like hobbit homes that had lost their charm. But they were insulated, they were swift to build, and best of all, they were virtually free, making them to 19th century settlers what IKEA is to modern studio apartments: functional, confusingly fashionable, and slightly damp. The walls were packed with earth, the ceilings, beams covered with sod, green in the summer, frost-kissed in the winter. They offered the kind of quiet where every sound muffles and every creak or cough sounds important. Imagine yourself curled up under a patchwork quilt in such a little hobbit hovel. A cast-iron stove murmurs in the corner, and outside, the blizzard pouts because it's been outwitted yet again. Then there were the Métis wintering cabins. These delightful little masterpieces were part French-Canadian ingenuity, part indigenous practicality, and all charm. Small, sturdy, and sweetly crafted with dovetail joints and packed moss insulation, they were often built near rivers and trading routes. Think of them as the Airbnbs of the fur trade, except instead of 5 stars, you were rated on how many pelts you procured and whether or not your chimney smoked out the squirrels. Even farther north, the Inuit practiced the art of true winter living. Their snow houses, yes, igloos, but let's give them their proper due, were literal sculptures of survival. Snow, the very thing others feared, became brick and beam, with curved walls that resisted Arctic winds and sealskin-lined entry tunnels to keep warm air in and polar bears out. These dwellings were precise, scientific marvels, built by people who knew snow better than most of us know our own Netflix cues. We could go on listing, but perhaps you're already imagining folding yourself into one of these shelters. The way the lamplight flickers across packed earth or carved snow. The way the silence after a snowfall is so complete, you begin to hear the whisper of your own heartbeat, wondering if perhaps it's beating in rhythm with the flicker of history itself. Because these were not just shelters, they were acts of survival stitched together by battered hands in bitter cold, ingenuity pressed into every log, sod, or snowbrick. People left behind cities, and even common sense in some cases, and built havens against the winter with whatever they had, be it bark, dirt, or an admirable amount of optimism. And while stories celebrate the journeys, it's the pauses, the places of refuge, that allowed those journeys to continue. So now, as the storm outside drifts further away into memory, and your own blanket has become a soft, warming roof, rest easy. The fires of history have warmed us once again. And beneath centuries of snow and soil, the quiet shelters that saved lives still whisper their secrets to the wind. Sleep comes quietly here. Let it arrive like snow, soft and certain, and drift you gently home.